Our next speaker is Dr. Hoffman from NC State.
So first, let me introduce myself. My name is Mark Hoffman, and I am the Smart Fruits Extension Specialist at NC State. And I tried to cut my hair myself today. That's why it looks like this. And I am in North Carolina for 3 years, and originally from Germany, and work with strawberries now for 5 or 6 years. 6 years, 5.5 years. And I was tasked today to talk about strawberry disease management, which is a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I so I will give some presentations today from a colleague of mine who's our plant pathologist. So this is what we're going to do today. And the first goal we have, so I have what I want everybody to understand at the end is what are the 5 most important diseases which we find here in North Carolina. So I'm pretty sure that's very similar to what you guys find. And then a little bit about the biology and identification of those, and some of the most important management tips. And then we also have some resources which I would like to share with you. A phone app, and there are some other resources on the internet which are really easy to access. So that's the goal here, and then we have like 3 chapters which we talk about. As I said, first, just like very quick, what are the most common diseases which we find, and I would like to hear from you too. What are the most common diseases which you find in your fields? And then we just go over a little bit about the biology, and then at the end, I will give some management tips and some resources where you can look for a spray schedule and more identification. So any idea what common diseases in strawberries are? Please put that into the chat box for about a minute or so. If you want to put it into the chat box, like any idea on diseases. What are the common diseases which you find in strawberries? Now I still have to figure out how to access the chat box.
You have botrytis and anthracnose, or gray mold.
Yeah, very good. So those are the ones which we find here in North Carolina as well. Those are 5. So anthracnose has 2 different forms. There's Anthracnose fruit rot, which is a different pathogen than Anthracnose crown rot. And so we're going to talk about those 2, and we find both of them frequently in strawberries. And then gray mold, as was indicated, which is Botrytis cinerea, which is another pathogen. And then another one which we find a lot here is Phytophthora root rot. That's a very common one and often can be confused with anthracnose, especially with Anthracnose crown rot in the field. And then also we find quite a bit of foliar diseases. There is a new disease which might be of interest, so we're going to talk a little bit about that disease as well. And so those are the 5 diseases which we majorly talk about today. And the new disease is neopistolopsiosis, which is we call it NeoP. That's a disease which was discovered a couple of years ago in a nursery here in North Carolina, and since then has been observed in several production fields, not all across the whole East Coast, really. Yeah, so, and then I'm gonna have to shift presentations, and so what you're going to see now is a presentation from Bill Klein, who is our actually a strawberry plant pathologist, the horticulture crop station, and we had a training just a couple of months ago where this presentation is from. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to look over some of the major pathogens in strawberry and how to manage them and how to avoid them, and then we're going to review some of the other resources for you to use. So first we have a plant disease and insect clinic, and that plant disease and insect clinic does review quite a bit of strawberry samples every year. And if we look at this, what happens in 2020, those are the most common problems we found in strawberry fields in 2020. And you can see here, anthracnose was a big problem. Phytophthora, always a big reason why strawberry plants might have died. Gray mold was one which was identified pretty often, especially after row cover use. So we use row covers here, with the exception of the mountains where we use row covers quite consistently over winter, but usually we use row covers here only to increase growing degree days and to frost protect. And then we had some leaf disease problems. We had some fields where we found neopestalopsiosis as well. And we also find things like herbicide injury, fumigant injury, and things like the conditions of plants or the post-plant care, which we're going to talk about later, which was a reason for growth depression or even for dying plants. And if you have a question, put it into the chat box. I'm still trying to figure out how to access the chat box. I think Gordon is able to look at that. So that would be, just feel free to ask questions anytime. So first, strawberry anthracnose, fruit rot, and crown rot. So those are two different pathogens. They're both from the species or from the genus of Coleoptera. And they appear relatively often in fruiting fields here in North Carolina. Fruit rot is often associated with Coleoptera acutatum, and crown rot is often associated with Coleoptera cleosporitis. So now cleosporitis can also cause symptoms like you see with an acutatum, but most often you would see collapsing plants with cleosporitis, and you would see later in the season dark spots on the plants with acutatum. So from a diagnostic side, what we usually do is we look at spores, acutatum, and cleosporitis have different spores on the microscope. As you can see, they're relatively easy to identify, but again, you would have to bring that to a lab or to a clinic for people to identify those kind of spores, or maybe your extension agent is able with a microscope to identify the spores as well. Another pretty easy symptom to identify is the root marbling, which is basically if you cut through the crown into the root system, you would see those yellow marbles here, and those like dark spots here. Again, that is not indicative for necessarily only crown rot. You can have the similar symptoms with Phytophthora, for example. Browning can also occur if you have like winter damage or cold damage in your crown from too low temperatures. So really, the only way to identify this 100% is by sending it to somebody who can identify that. In our case, in North Carolina, it would be the Plant Disease and Insect Clinic. And I'm pretty sure there's an equivalent in Delaware as well, where you can send it to. So that's, for us, the only way to really identify what kind of system it is. So now this picture, as I said, Phytophthora and anthracnose can be very similar. So I would like you to put into the chat box, what do you think what this is? Do you think it is Phytophthora, or do you think it's anthracnose? So Phytophthora and anthracnose can have very similar symptoms. As you can see here, the plants are collapsing. And oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, most people are guessing Phytophthora, but only a few people are guessing.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so most people are right. This is Phytophthora root rot. But again, from a diagnostic standpoint, it's hard to say before sending a sample in to a diagnostic clinic and have it identified. But you see here again through the crown, you see those large brown rods. You usually don't see that much marbling here. Yeah, so Anthracnose, crown rot, and Phytophthora root rot look very similar. Both can cause very large damages to the plant and lead to like certain wilting experiences even later in the season, like you can see here. This plant is already fruiting and has died because of Phytophthora. So Phytophthora, from a diagnostic point of view, it's really easy to identify. It develops very specific spores, but again, you're going to have to send that to the lab, or use one of those Aegida immunostrips, which can identify a Phytophthora in the field, actually. So
You
now,
had a question in the chat about the Phytophthora. When is it most prevalent in the growing season? When in the growing season do you see that?
So Phytophthora can come in through planting material, especially if you use plug plants. That can be the case because Phytophthora is transported through water mostly. So the spores are water transported. So we often see Phytophthora at the beginning of the planting season, if sometimes even in the plugs already, in the plug plants already. And then we recommend usually not to plant those plants. And if you see it in the plugins, you see your plants collapsing or wilting, and they're still in the trays, then we would separate those plants. Again, as we said, Phytophthora can transport through water, and then not to plant them. And one common management method for us is using rotomill through the drip line after planting. We often do that just to prevent it, not even if we don't see symptoms, in case we still have Phytophthora brought in through the planting material. Usually it's a common practice for us to apply rotomill about 1 to 2 weeks after planting in the drip line, so that we can control oomycetes, which is Phytophthora is one of them. Pythium is another oomycete. So that is one time when we see it. And then another time, if it's in the field, you can see it, as I showed before, during the fruiting season, when the plant starts to grow, and when you have a lot of rain, or when you start watering your fields. That is another time when you can see Phytophthora outbreaks in your field, when we see it pretty often. With crown rot, Anthracnose crown rot, there are cases where it can come through nursery material to planting material also, and Anthracnose crown rot can also be coming through bare root plants. It doesn't have to, because it's not necessarily waterborne. So we also see Anthracnose crown rot outbreaks at the beginning of the fruiting season. Not very often. We didn't see a big outbreak this year, 2020. We had one, I believe, 2019, where we found Anthracnose crown rot in a lot of places, and it varies really from year to year. So I hope that answers the question. Then a couple of other diseases which we find often is phomopsis, leaf blight. That is phomopsis obstructans that can cause those large black spots with red margins on the leaves. And then another one which is around now since 2020 is a neopistolopsiosis, leaf blight. Again, that is a disease which can go onto the leaves, but it also can go onto fruit production. And originally was found in Florida in fruiting fields coming through planting material, which is grown here in North Carolina, and in Florida it was observed as on leaves and on fruiting. Now you have to understand that in Florida, the production cycle is very different. They usually fruit directly the plants. They don't go through like a winter. But we also found it on plug plants, which for production areas all over the East Coast, really. So we found definitely some in Pennsylvania. We found some in North Carolina. I know that, and I'm pretty sure there are other areas where we found neopistolopsiosis too. So it can cause the plant to die. And what we usually recommend is that if you see plug plants which look like those in this picture, either take off those leaves or just don't even plant them. And we know that Thyrum is a pesticide which can which can help to mitigate those problems pretty early in the season. And we do not know if it survives the winter or not, and we do not know how it will look like in the next season, because this is the first year where we find a larger spread. I'm pretty sure Kathy can talk about this later too. She put out a pretty nice, a very good recommendation on how to handle neopastalopsiosis after planting. So pastalopsiosis again looks very similar to a lot of other leaf spots, so you have to bring it to a clinic. The spores are very, very, very distinctive. So once you put it under the microscope and you see those kind of spores, you know that this is a pastalopsiosis pathogen. And then we have a couple of other things which I'm not going over: hail damage, and then I want to go over some of the management tips. So I'm gonna switch presentations again, and we'll just ground up a little bit what we talked about. So the most important reasons where plants die shortly after transplanting, there are a couple of one of them is Phytophthora, and the other one is Anthracnose. The neopastalopsiosis might be one, but often we see also that there's fumigant residue, incorrect planting, there's not enough water, or like the drip line is broken and the water was not applied, the soil is too dry. We have that problem often. Or very often is that the plug plants were weak or not very well developed. So, and often you see a mix of those as reasons for plants that will not establish very well in the summer. So I kind of summarized like 5 things which you really should not do when you go and plant in terms of disease. And the one thing which I feel is really important is never just walk away after planting. If you plant plug plants, you have to observe, you have to use Rhodamil, and use your Captain and Thyrum applications to make sure that your plantings are healthy. But I also recommend to order more than you need, because you're going to have to replant. And especially with like the new diseases which are around, you might want to plant instead of like 3 to 5%, maybe more 10% of plants, which you probably have to replant. So that is kind of what I recommend. Also, another thing which you never should do is don't plant underdeveloped plug plants. You see here on the left-hand side in this picture, that's a nursery which had a lot of Anthracnose crown rot in this case. And you see here like plug plants are which are collapsing. So you don't wanna plant those plants. Those plants should not go into the field at all. And you see here an example of very underdeveloped and wrongly planted plug plants. So those plants are planted too deep in the tray. You can see here the crown is not showing up, and they also don't have a very well developed root system. So those plants would not perform very well in the field from the get-go. And then of course, if you have something like this where you have like an old tip stuck and you see like 2 or 3 leaves, but you don't have any developed root system, which is, well, I had a lot of those plugs last year. You don't want to plant those plug plants as well. So that's a common mistake, that people still think those plants will develop. You might be lucky in the will, but you will have a lot of problems from the get-go if you do use this planting material. Also, don't use a low pressure sprayer to apply pesticides. We recommend a minimum of 80 psi, especially in the summer later if the plants are large. You want to reach inside the canopy, you want to reach the flowers, and you want to reach the fruit. And you need to have a certain amount of pressure to do that. And also don't apply row covers before you do botrytis control. That is a North Carolina recommendation. If we apply row covers either in winter or in spring, we usually recommend to have botrytis control before we apply row covers, because we know under row covers botrytis is a big problem. And botrytis can also come in through planting materials, so it's also important to scout your plants for botrytis before they go into winter, because that's often, if you remove the inoculum before you put on your row covers, you reduce the chance that you will have a botrytis outbreak under the row covers. significantly. So that is another thing which people often don't do. And then last but not least, if you have diseased plants in your in your field, sometimes they look still like there's like a little bit growth left, don't leave them in there. You know, especially if you know what the problem is, especially if you know that it's anthracnose or Phytophthora, or it's a disease problem, you need to take those plants out because they only spread the inoculum more. And leaving those kind of plants in the field does not make a lot of sense from a disease point of view. So now I would like to talk about a couple of resources which are available to growers, and the two big ones are the My IPM app and the Southern Regional Small Fruits Consortium, the Strawberry IPM Guide. And I will switch back to the other presentation quick to talk a little bit about the My IPM app, because that's a phone app which is for strawberries very well developed, and it is one of the best one of a very useful app. And this is how it looks like. You can download it on every in Google Apps or Google Play or in the App Store, and it's free. And for the strawberry section, a lot of people all across the East Coast have worked to make sure that you can identify your diseases and that you know what to spray and when to spray. And it's updated almost every year with new information, and it's free as well. You only have to download it. And it's a very useful resource. I use it all the time. I know a lot of growers here who use it all the time, so I really highly can recommend it. There is a video also, which if you don't familiar with the My IPM, you can look it up under Vimeo. And this is how it looks like if you open it up on your phone. They have several diseases, so you can download basically for several crops. There's for blackberry, blueberry, and strawberry. There's also one for grapes. And you basically can go and select your pathogen, and you see pictures. You usually have 6 to 7 pictures per pathogen. You have a diagnostic and management section, and then you have a general section as well. So that is a very, very useful tool for everybody. And for example, you can do it for botrytis, and you see here, this is how it looks when it's at the crown. And you have chemical control methods that you also can click on play, and it's going to be read to you. So it is very, very useful tool. There are conventional organic recommendations in it. And then another tool which I would like to mention quick is the Southeast Regional Strawberry Integrated Pest Management Guide for plastic culture production. That is also updated every year. It contains very similar information like the My IPM app. It has more spray recommendations in there, and less pictures. There are no pictures in it, but there is a very, very thorough recommendations on what to spray and what pesticides you can use and which amount you can use it, when to use it. So that's a very, very important resource, and it's again free. You just have to access it and print it out. And to access it, it's basically the homepage looks like this, and there's an IPM production guide. That's where you click on. Then you click here on strawberries, and you see here you have like a regional strawberry integrated pest management guide. This is the one which you're going to click. And you also have fungicide selections for botrytis and anthracnose, because one thing I didn't talk about today because we don't have time is that anthracnose can show resistance to a certain to like a range of fungicides really. And there's a selection. So we have a selection tool there where you can look on which fungicide you can use if you find resistance in your botrytis or your anthracnose populations. So very, very useful. And then also we have our strawberry portal at NC State where we give updates. And there is the diagnostic key, which is an online, so you're gonna have to have a computer, but you can look at the computer, and they also have pictures for you for the most of the diseases which are there, plus recommendations. And then of course our Strawberry Association and our Google and App Store. So I know I didn't cover all and everything, but I'm running out of time. So I thank everybody. And if you have questions, just feel free to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.